The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October 1926, carried by a postman whose boots were already caked with the first fallen leaves of autumn. Margaret Clark accepted the envelope with a polite nod, noting the Rutland County seal stamped in the corner. Her husband, Thomas, looked up from his coffee and newspaper as she unsealed it at their kitchen table. "It's from Uncle Edwin's attorney," Margaret said, her eyes scanning the formal script. He's left us his house." Thomas set down his cup, the porcelain making a sharp sound against the wooden table. "Edwin Clark? The one who lived as a recluse up on Miller Hill?" Margaret nodded, continuing to read. "Says here he passed 3 weeks ago. No immediate family to speak of." She looked up, meeting her husband's gaze. "Thomas, this could be our chance. You know how the textile mill has been struggling. The foreman said there might be more layoffs coming." Thomas ran a hand through his dark hair, streaked prematurely with grey at 38. The Great War and subsequent years at the mill had aged him beyond his years. "A house of our own, Maggie. No more renting this cramped apartment." "It says the property is quite substantial. 3 stories, 5 bedrooms, a generous plot of land." Margaret's voice took on a dreamlike quality. After 7 years of marriage and struggling to make ends meet in their 1-bedroom apartment above Rutland's pharmacy, the prospect seemed almost too good to be true. "What's the catch?" Thomas asked, the perpetual worry lines on his forehead deepening. "No catch mentioned. Just that we need to maintain residency for at least 1 year before we can sell it, should we choose to." Margaret folded the letter carefully. "Uncle Edwin was peculiar, but he was the last of your family with any means." Thomas nodded slowly. He barely remembered his father's uncle, a tall, thin man who had attended his parents' funeral when Thomas was just 8 years old. Edwin had placed a cold hand on young Thomas's shoulder and said something about family looking after its own before disappearing back to his secluded life. "We should go see it tomorrow," Thomas decided. "I can take a day from the mill." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat by their bedroom window, watching the lights of Rutland's modest downtown fade as businesses closed for the evening. Their apartment faced east, and in the distance she could just make out the dark silhouette of Miller Hill against the star-filled Vermont sky. Something about the inheritance made her uneasy. Perhaps it was simply that good fortune had been so rare in their lives. The war had taken Thomas's brother and left Thomas himself with a persistent cough from the gas attacks. The economic uncertainty that followed had crushed their dreams of starting a family. "A fresh start," she whispered to herself, trying to quell the inexplicable dread that had settled in her stomach. "That's all it is." The next morning dawned bright but cool. They borrowed Mr. Peterson's automobile, a kindness from their neighbor in exchange for Thomas helping repair his roof the previous summer. The drive to Miller Hill took less than 30 minutes, but it felt like crossing into another world. The bustle of Rutland streets gave way to winding country roads lined with maples and oaks blazing in autumn colors. The Clark house appeared suddenly around a bend, standing alone atop a gentle slope. It was an imposing Victorian structure. 3 stories of weathered clapboard painted a faded grey with dark green shutters. A wraparound porch encircled the first floor, its ornate balusters casting intricate shadows in the morning light. "It's bigger than I imagined," Margaret said as Thomas parked the automobile. "Uncle Edwin lived here alone all these years?" Thomas murmured, craning his neck to see the upper floors. The attorney had said a key would be waiting with the caretaker, Mr. Holloway, who lived in a smaller house down the road. But as they approached the front steps, they found an envelope nailed to the door with Clark written in angular script. Inside was a heavy iron key and a note. "Welcome home. Mr. Holloway has been relieved of his duties." Thomas unlocked the door, which swung open with a low, protesting groan. The smell of old wood, dust, and something else, something vaguely sweet but unidentifiable, wafted out to greet them. "Shall we?" Thomas asked, offering his hand to Margaret. She took it, squeezing tightly as they stepped across the threshold together into the shadows of what was now their home. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through the tall windows as Margaret and Thomas explored their inheritance. The first floor contained a parlour, dining room, kitchen and library, all furnished with heavy Victorian pieces draped in white sheets. Thomas pulled back one cover to reveal a velvet settee, its deep burgundy still vibrant despite years of disuse. "The furniture alone must be worth a small fortune," he remarked, running his hand over the carved wooden frame. Margaret nodded absently, her attention drawn to the photographs arranged on the mantelpiece. She wiped away years of dust to reveal stern faces of Clark ancestors, men with high collars and women in buttoned-up dresses, all sharing the same solemn expression. None smiled for the camera. "Your eyes," she said softly when Thomas joined her. "They all have your eyes." Nay, the second floor contained 4 bedrooms and a bathroom with surprisingly modern plumbing. The master bedroom occupied the front of the house, with windows overlooking the driveway and the distant rooftops of Rutland. "This will be ours," Thomas decided, testing the 4-poster bed with its faded quilt. It was the 3rd floor that Margaret found most curious. Unlike the rest of the house, which followed a logical layout, the top floor was a maze of small rooms and narrow hallways. Some doors opened to spaces barely large enough for a single chair, while others revealed long, narrow chambers with slanted ceilings following the roofline. What would one man need with all these rooms? She wondered aloud. The largest room on the 3rd floor was directly above the master bedroom. Unlike the other spaces, this one was completely empty. No furniture, no rugs, nothing on the walls. Just bare hardwood floors and white plaster walls. "Storage, perhaps?" Thomas suggested, though his tone indicated he found it just as puzzling. By late afternoon, they had decided to spend the night. Thomas drove back to their apartment to gather some essentials, while Margaret began the task of making the house habitable. She found clean linens in a hall closet and made up the master bed, then swept decades of dust from the kitchen and started a fire in the cast-iron stove. When Thomas returned, he brought provisions along with their clothing. "Mrs. Peterson insisted we take her vegetable soup," he said, setting a covered pot on the kitchen counter, "and half a loaf of her bread." They ate by candlelight in the dining room, the soup warming them against the growing autumn chill. The house creaked and settled around them, the sounds amplified in the high-ceiling space. "It needs work," Thomas acknowledged, "but think of what we could make of it." Margaret smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, it has potential." After dinner, they retired early, exhausted from the day's explorations. The master bedroom was cold, despite the extra blankets Margaret had piled on the bed. They changed quickly and slipped under the covers, Thomas's arm coming around Margaret's waist to pull her close. "Happy?" he whispered against her hair. "Yes," she replied, though the word felt hollow in her mouth. The house, with its labyrinthine 3rd floor and too many empty rooms, disquieted her in ways she couldn't articulate. Sleep came fitfully to Margaret. Each time she drifted off, she jerked awake at some small sound, the house contracting in the cold, the branches of a nearby tree scratching against the siding, or something else entirely. Thomas, exhausted from months of factory work, slept deeply beside her. It was just past midnight when she heard it, a soft thump from directly above them, in that empty 3rd-floor room. Margaret lay still, straining to listen. Another thump, followed by what sounded like something being dragged across the floor. "Thomas!" she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "Thomas! Wake up!" He stirred, mumbling incoherently. "I heard something upstairs," she persisted. This roused him partially. "Old houses make sounds, Maggie," he murmured, eyes still closed. "No, it sounded like footsteps or something moving." Thomas sighed, rolling onto his back. "We checked every room. There's no one here but us." As if in direct challenge to his assertion, another thump sounded overhead, louder than before. Thomas's eyes snapped open. "That's not the house settling," Margaret said, clutching the blankets to her chest. Thomas rose, reaching for his robe. "Stay here, I'll check." "No!" Margaret seized his arm. "Don't leave me alone." After a moment's hesitation, Thomas nodded. "We'll go together." They lit a kerosene lamp and made their way to the third floor, the wooden steps creaking beneath their weight. The air grew noticeably colder as they ascended. When they reached the empty room above their bedroom, Thomas held the lamp high, illuminating the bare space. Nothing had changed. No furniture had appeared. No windows stood open. The room was exactly as they had left it hours earlier. "See?" "Nothing," Thomas said, relief evident in his voice. But as Margaret stepped into the room, her foot struck something small that skittered across the floor. Thomas directed the lamplight toward the sound. There, in the corner of the empty room, sat a small wooden toy, a hand-carved horse on wheels, its paint faded and chipped with age. "That wasn't here before," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Thomas picked up the toy, turning it over in his hands. "It must have been. We simply missed it earlier." But Margaret knew they hadn't missed it. The room had been completely empty, and now, as she stood in its center with goosebumps rising on her arms, she could have sworn she heard the faintest sound of a child's laughter, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dawn broke over Miller Hill with a thin, watery light that did little to warm the October chill. Margaret had dozed fitfully after their midnight discovery, starting awake at every creak and groan of the old house. Thomas, more pragmatic by nature, had placed the wooden horse on the bedside table and fallen back into a deep sleep. In the harsh light of morning, Margaret studied the toy while Thomas washed and dressed. The craftsmanship was remarkable, each muscle of the horse defined, its mane and tail intricately carved. Despite its age, evidenced by the cracked paint and worn wheels, it was a beautiful piece. "I'm going to find Mr. Holloway," Thomas announced, buttoning his vest. The note said he was relieved of his duties, but he must know something about the house and Uncle Edwin. "I'll come with you," Margaret said quickly. The thought of remaining alone in the house made her stomach knot with anxiety. They found Holloway's cottage a quarter-mile down the winding road, a modest structure with smoke curling from its chimney. A man in his 60s was splitting wood in the yard, his breath forming clouds in the cool morning air. He paused mid-swing when he saw them approach. "You must be Edwin's nephew," he said without preamble, leaning on his axe handle. His face was deeply lined with shrewd eyes that assessed them openly. "Thomas Clark," Thomas confirmed, extending his hand, "and my wife, Margaret." Holloway hesitated before accepting the handshake. "Arthur Holloway, I expected you'd come around eventually." He glanced at the house visible through the trees. "How was your first night?" The directness of the question caught Margaret off guard. "We found something unusual," she said before Thomas could respond with pleasantries. She opened her handbag and carefully removed the wooden horse, which she'd wrapped in a handkerchief. Holloway's face drained of color. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "In the empty room on the third floor," Thomas explained. "It wasn't there when we explored the house, but last night we heard noises and found this." Holloway set down his axe and wiped his palms on his trousers. "You'd better come inside." The caretaker's cottage was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. Holloway gestured for them to sit at a small table while he poured 3 cups from a pot on the stove. "I cared for that house and for Edwin Clark for 22 years, he began, setting the cups before them. "Until last month, when he dismissed me without explanation, paid me a generous severance and told me never to set foot on the property again." "Why?" Thomas asked. Holloway shook his head slowly. "Your uncle was always particular. But in his final weeks he changed, became agitated, suspicious, would stay awake for days at a time, pacing the third floor." Margaret's hands tightened around her cup. "What about this toy? Do you recognize it?" "I do." Holloway stared at the wooden horse sitting on his table. "It belonged to a child who lived in that house nearly 40 years ago. Edwin's younger brother, William, had a daughter, Lily, I believe her name was. She died in that house during the winter of 1887. Thomas frowned. Uncle Edwin never mentioned any niece. He wouldn't have. After the child died, the family scattered. William moved west, I believe. Edwin remained alone in that house with its memories. Holloway paused, choosing his next words carefully. The empty room where you found this toy, that was the child's bedroom. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather ran down Margaret's spine. But the room is empty. No bed, no furniture at all. Edwin had everything removed after her death. Wouldn't allow so much as a picture frame to hang on those walls. Holloway took a slow sip of his coffee. But the toys, they were a different matter. What do you mean? Thomas pressed. Over the years I worked there, I found toys in that room dozens of times. A doll, building blocks, a tin soldier. Each time, I'd bring them to Edwin. He'd burn them in the garden without saying a word. Holloway's weathered face creased with concern. The last time it happened was just before he dismissed me. I found a jack-in-the-box sitting in the center of that empty room. When I showed it to him, he flew into a rage like I'd never seen. Are you suggesting... Thomas began, but couldn't seem to finish the thought. I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Clark. I'm telling you what I witnessed. Holloway leaned forward. That house holds memories. Some say the walls themselves remember what happened there. What did happen to the child? Margaret asked softly. Holloway's gaze shifted to the window, where the upper floors of the Clark house were visible through the trees. The official record says she fell down the stairs. A tragic accident. His voice dropped even lower. But there were rumors, even then. The child had bruises that couldn't be explained by a fall. A heavy silence fell over the cottage. What should we do with the toy? Thomas finally asked, practical as always. If I were you, Holloway said, rising from his chair, I'd burn it just as Edwin did. And then I'd pack my belongings and return to Rutland before nightfall. We can't just leave, Thomas protested. The terms of the inheritance require us to live there for a year. Holloway's expression darkened. Some inheritances come with costs that aren't written in legal documents, Mr. Clark. As they walked back to the house, Margaret clutched the wooden horse tightly in her hand. The morning had grown no warmer, and the trees surrounding the property seemed to lean inward, as if whispering secrets among themselves. He's just a superstitious old man, Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. Probably enjoyed frightening us with ghost stories. Then how do you explain this? Margaret held up the toy. You saw that room yourself, Thomas. It was empty. Thomas had no answer for that. When they reached the house, he busied himself checking the furnace in the basement while Margaret stood in the entrance hall, looking up at the ceiling where, 2 floors above, the empty room waited. On an impulse, she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The room was exactly as they'd left it the night before. Bare walls, bare floor, cold air. Margaret placed the wooden horse in the center of the room, then quickly backed away, as if it might suddenly animate. "Who are you?" she whispered to the empty space. "What do you want from us?" The only response was the distant sound of Thomas in the basement, and the soft sighing of wind through the eaves. The remainder of the day passed in tense silence as Thomas and Margaret attempted to settle into their new home. Thomas threw himself into practical matters, checking the roof for leaks, ensuring the water pump was functioning properly, taking inventory of the coal supply for winter. Margaret tried to make the kitchen habitable, scrubbing decades of grime from the countertops and organizing the pantry shelves. Neither mentioned the wooden horse that now sat in the center of the empty 3rd-floor room, nor did they discuss Holloway's disturbing revelations, but the knowledge hung between them, an unspoken weight that made their movements cautious and their conversations stilted. As dusk approached, they prepared a simple dinner from the provisions they'd brought. Thomas uncorked a bottle of wine he'd purchased in Rutland, pouring generous glasses for them both. "A toast," he said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings." Margaret clinked her glass against his, forcing a smile. "To the Clarks of Miller Hill." The wine helped ease the tension, and by the time they retired to the parlor with the second bottle, Margaret found herself almost relaxing. Thomas stoked the fire in the large stone fireplace, and the dancing flames cast warm shadows across the room. "It's not so bad, is it?" he asked, settling beside her on the settee. "A grand old house with good bones. Just needs some life breathed back into it." Margaret leaned against his shoulder, allowing herself to imagine, just for a moment, the possibility of happiness here. "Perhaps we could finally start a family," she said softly. "Lord knows we have enough bedrooms." Thomas wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "That's the spirit, Maggie. We'll make this house our own." Later, as they prepared for bed, Margaret found herself hesitating at the bedroom door. "Thomas, I don't want to sleep in this room tonight." He paused in unbuttoning his shirt. "Because it's directly below." She nodded, unable to say it aloud. "All right," he agreed after a moment's consideration. "We'll take the bedroom at the back of the house." They made up one of the smaller bedrooms with fresh linens. This room had clearly been a guest chamber. Its furnishings were simpler, less imposing than those in the master suite. A painting of the Green Mountains hung above the bed, the only decoration on the pale blue walls. Margaret changed into her nightgown behind a folding screen while Thomas banked the fire in the small fireplace. The wine had made her drowsy, and despite her lingering unease, she found herself yawning as she slipped beneath the covers. "Rest now," Thomas murmured, kissing her forehead. "Things always look brighter in the morning light." Whether from exhaustion or the wine's effect, Margaret fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. Her dreams were fragmented, images of winding hallways and doors that opened onto other doors, a maze with no center and no exit. She woke with a start several hours later, heart racing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see Thomas sleeping beside her. For a moment, she couldn't identify what had awakened her. Then she heard it, soft footsteps in the hallway outside their door. Margaret lay perfectly still, straining to listen. The steps were light, almost hesitant, moving slowly past their room toward the staircase. Not Thomas's heavy tread, not an adult's stride at all, but the tentative steps of a small child. She reached out to wake Thomas, then stopped herself. He would insist on investigating, on confronting whatever walked the halls of their new home. And somehow, Margaret knew that was precisely what the presence wanted. Instead, she pressed her face into the pillow and began to silently recite the Lord's Prayer, just as she had done as a child when frightened by thunderstorms or bad dreams. The footsteps paused outside their door, and Margaret could feel a weight to the silence, as if something was listening, considering. After what seemed an eternity, the steps resumed, moving away down the hall and up the stairs to the third floor. Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She must have drifted back to sleep eventually, because the next thing she knew, grey morning light was filtering through the curtains, and Thomas was stirring beside her. "You look pale," he remarked as they dressed. "Didn't sleep well?" Margaret hesitated, then decided against sharing her nocturnal experience. "Just adjusting to a new bed," she said. After a quick breakfast, Thomas announced he needed to return to Rutland to settle matters with their landlord and collect more of their belongings. "Will you be all right here alone?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Of course," Margaret lied, her stomach clenching at the prospect. "I have plenty to keep me busy." Once Thomas had departed in Mr. Peterson's borrowed automobile, Margaret steeled herself and climbed the stairs to the third floor. The empty room waited, morning sunlight streaming through its east-facing windows. The wooden horse was gone. Margaret searched the entire room, looking behind the door and in the corners, even checking the ceiling for some hidden compartment. Nothing. The toy had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Heart pounding, she began a systematic search of the house. She checked every room on the third floor, then worked her way down to the second. In the master bedroom, the one they'd abandoned the night before, she found the horse sitting on the pillow where her head would have rested. Alongside it was a small china doll with a porcelain face and cloth body, dressed in a faded blue pinafore. Its painted eyes seemed to follow Margaret as she backed slowly out of the room. Margaret fled the master bedroom, slamming the door behind her with such force that a nearby picture frame crashed to the floor, its glass shattering across the hallway. She stood with her back pressed against the wall, chest heaving, as if expecting the door to burst open and something to emerge. Nothing did. The house remained silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs and the occasional creak of timber adjusting to the warming day. "This is madness," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. "Get hold of yourself, Margaret." She forced herself to consider logical explanations. Perhaps Thomas had moved the toy as some misguided prank, but that wouldn't explain the doll, which neither of them had seen before. Maybe Holloway had a key and was playing games with them. The thought seemed absurd even as it formed. What would the old caretaker gain from such antics? Margaret descended to the kitchen, made herself a strong cup of tea and tried to organize her thoughts. The toys were real, tangible objects she could touch and move. Whatever was happening wasn't merely in her imagination. After finishing her tea, Margaret made a decision. If she was to live in this house, she needed to understand it. And to understand it, she needed to know more about its previous occupants, particularly the child Lily who had died here. The library seemed the logical place to start. It was a handsome room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a large desk positioned beneath windows that overlooked the side garden. Margaret began methodically examining the shelves, looking for family Bibles, photo albums, or journals, anything that might provide insight into the Clark family history. Most of the collection consisted of leather-bound classics and scientific texts that appeared untouched for decades. But on a lower shelf in the corner, partially hidden behind a set of encyclopedias, Margaret discovered a small wooden box. The box was simply made but beautiful, its lid inlaid with mother-of-pearl in the shape of a butterfly. Inside, she found a collection of daguerreotypes, early photographs preserved in small, hinged cases. The first showed a somber-faced man with a full beard standing beside a seated woman holding an infant. On the back, someone had written, "William and Eleanor Clark, with Lily, 1881. Margaret studied the image carefully. The woman, Eleanor, looked exhausted, her eyes haunted in a way that transcended the typically serious expressions of Victorian photography. William stood rigidly beside her, one hand resting possessively on her shoulder. The next daguerreotype showed a little girl of about 5 or 6, wearing a white dress with a dark sash. Her hair was arranged in careful ringlets, and she held a familiar object in her small hands, the wooden horse. On the back was written simply, "Lily, 1886. Unlike her parents, Lily wasn't looking at the camera. Her gaze was directed somewhere off to the side, as if distracted by something just out of frame. There was a wariness in her expression that seemed inappropriate for a child so young. The final photograph in the box showed 2 men standing in front of the house on Miller Hill. One was clearly William Clark, older than in the first image, his beard now streaked with grey. The other, Margaret presumed, was Edwin, taller and thinner than his brother, with a severe countenance that bordered on forbidding. As Margaret returned the photographs to their box, her fingers brushed against something else, a folded piece of paper tucked into the bottom. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, from the Rutland Herald dated January 15th, 1887. Tragic accident, claims child's life. Lily Clark, age 6, daughter of William and Eleanor Clark of Miller Hill, died Tuesday night after a fall down the stairs of the family home. Dr. Samuel Whitcomb, who attended the child, stated that death was instantaneous due to injuries sustained. The Clark family has requested privacy during their time of mourning. Funeral services will be held at St. Peter's Church on Friday. Margaret read the brief notice several times, searching for details that might corroborate or refute Holloway's insinuations about the circumstances of Lily's death. The article revealed nothing beyond the basic facts, though the request for privacy struck her as somewhat unusual for a public death notice. Her exploration of the library complete, Margaret decided to investigate the house itself more thoroughly. If Lily had fallen down the stairs, which staircase had it been? The main one in the entrance hall or the narrower servants' stairs at the back of the house? As she examined the main staircase, Margaret noted the height of each step and the steepness of the descent. A fall here, particularly from the top, could indeed prove fatal to a small child. She ran her hand along the banister, trying to imagine the sequence of events that January night nearly 40 years ago. Something caught her eye, a small imperfection in the woodwork of the banister about halfway down. Looking closer, Margaret discovered a section where the wood grain didn't quite match the surrounding area, as if a piece had been replaced. The repair was skillful, but visible to a discerning eye. Her examination of the main staircase complete, Margaret moved to the back of the house to check the servants' stairs. These were narrower and steeper, making them potentially even more dangerous. As she descended to the first floor, Margaret noticed a door beneath the staircase that she and Thomas had overlooked in their initial exploration. It was locked, but the skeleton key that opened the front door worked in this lock as well. The door swung inward to reveal a small storage space, or what should have been a storage space. Instead, Margaret found a child-sized table and chair, upon which sat a tea set arranged as if for a party. A doll, not the one from the bedroom but another, older and more worn, sat in the chair, its faded dress covered in a thin layer of dust. Margaret's skin prickled with gooseflesh. This hidden playroom had been locked, yet it contained evidence of recent use. The teacups were filled with what appeared to be actual tea, long since evaporated, to leave brown rings at the bottom of each cup. As she backed out of the small room, Margaret's heel caught on something. Looking down, she saw a piece of paper that had been pushed partway under the door from the outside, from the very hallway where she now stood. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. It was a child's drawing done in colored pencil, depicting a house that was recognizably the one on Miller Hill. In front of the house stood 3 figures, a tall man, a woman, and between them, a small girl in a blue dress. The girl's face had been colored entirely in black. At the bottom of the page, in the uneven printing of a child learning to write, were the words, "I'm still here." Margaret dropped the drawing as if it had burned her fingers. It fluttered to the floor, coming to rest face up, the black-faced child seeming to stare at her despite having no visible eyes. From upstairs came the distinct sound of childish laughter, followed by the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair that Margaret knew for certain had not been there when she'd fled the master bedroom an hour before. Margaret stood frozen in the hallway, the child's drawing at her feet and the sound of the phantom rocking chair creaking overhead. A rational part of her mind screamed to flee the house immediately, to run down the winding road to Holloway's cottage or all the way to Rutland if necessary. But a deeper instinct held her in place. Running would solve nothing. The mystery of this house would follow her. With deliberate calm, she picked up the drawing and folded it carefully before placing it in her pocket. Then, gathering her courage, she ascended the stairs once more. The sound of rocking had stopped by the time she reached the second-floor landing. The door to the master bedroom stood slightly ajar, though Margaret was certain she had closed it firmly. She pushed it open with her fingertips, bracing herself for what she might find. A rocking chair now sat by the window, gently swaying as if recently vacated. The wooden horse and china doll remained on the pillow, exactly as she had left them. Nothing else in the room appeared disturbed. Margaret approached the rocking chair cautiously. It was a child's chair, its frame darkened with age, but finely crafted. Like the horse, it showed signs of frequent use. The armrests were worn smooth where small hands would have gripped them. As she examined the chair, Margaret noticed something tucked between the cushion and the wooden frame. She extracted a small notebook bound in faded blue cloth, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. Opening it, she found pages filled with a woman's careful handwriting, the loops and flourishes, characteristic of someone educated in penmanship during the previous century. The first entry was dated September 3rd, 1886. Dr. Whitcomb has prescribed laudanum for my nerves, though I told him it is not my nerves that concern me, but Lily's safety. He dismisses my fears as female hysteria, as does William. Only Edwin listens, though he can do nothing against his brother's authority in this house. Margaret sat in the rocking chair, transfixed by the journal. This must be Eleanor Clark's private writings. She turned to the next entry, dated September 17th. Lily showed me another bruise today, this one on her back where she couldn't have caused it herself through play. When I confronted William, he flew into one of his rages. Later he apologized, as he always does, bringing me flowers from the garden and promising it won't happen again. But his eyes remain cold, even when his lips smile. A chill ran through Margaret as the implications became clear. She continued reading, each entry more disturbing than the last. October 5th, 1886. William has forbidden Lily from playing with her toys, saying they distract her from her studies. She is 6 years old. What studies could be so important as to deny a child such small pleasures? I sneaked the wooden horse back to her room tonight after William retired to his study with his whiskey. October 30th, 1886. Found Lily hiding in the storage space beneath the back stairs today. She has created a little world there with her tea set and the doll my mother gave her. I promise not to tell William. This will be our secret place where he cannot reach her. November 12th, 1886. Edwin and William quarreled terribly tonight. I couldn't hear all that was said, but Edwin threatened to contact the authorities if things don't change. William reminded him that half the property belongs to him by their father's will, and that Edwin has no legal right to interfere in how he raises his daughter. December 24th, 1886. Christmas Eve, and Lily should be excited for the morning. Instead, she sits quietly in her room, jumping at every sound. William has been drinking heavily all day. I've locked her bedroom door and pocketed the key. Edwin has promised to stay awake tonight and keep watch. The final entry was dated January 10th, 1887, just 1 day before Lily's death. I can endure no more. We will leave tomorrow while William is at his club in Rutland. Edwin has arranged train tickets to Boston, where my sister will take us in until I can establish ourselves elsewhere. Lily knows to pack only one small bag with her essentials. I've told her to include her favorite toys, as we must leave much behind. God forgive me for not acting sooner. The journal ended there, with no explanation of what had transpired to prevent their escape. Margaret closed the book slowly, her mind racing. The official story, that Lily had died in an accidental fall, now seemed not just unlikely, but impossible, given Eleanor's documented fears. "Where is Eleanor's body buried?" Margaret whispered to herself. There had been only one death notice in the newspaper clipping. Lily's. What had happened to her mother? A new, terrible suspicion began to form in Margaret's mind. She thought of the toys appearing in the empty room. Lily's room. The child's drawing with its ominous message. The hidden tea party beneath the stairs. She's trying to tell us something, Margaret realized, clutching the journal to her chest. The sound of a door closing downstairs startled her from her thoughts. "Margaret?" Thomas's voice called up the stairwell. "Up here," she responded, hastily rising from the rocking chair. She debated whether to hide the journal, then decided against it. Thomas needed to know the truth as much as she did. His footsteps sounded heavily on the stairs, and moments later he appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from the cold. "What are you doing in here? I thought we agreed to use the back bedroom." His eyes fell on the rocking chair, then moved to the toys on the bed. "Where did those come from? And that chair, it wasn't here yesterday." "Sit down, Thomas," Margaret said, gesturing to the edge of the bed. "There's something you need to see." She showed him the journal, the photographs, and the child's drawing, explaining her discoveries in the library and beneath the back stairs. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is disturbing," he admitted when she finished, turning the drawing over in his hands. "But Maggie, it doesn't prove anything supernatural. The chair and toys could have been stored somewhere in the house. As for this drawing and the journal, they're certainly suggestive of a family tragedy, but not of a ghost." "Then how do you explain the toys moving from room to room? The footsteps I heard last night? The rocking chair that appeared while I was downstairs?" Margaret demanded, frustration rising in her voice. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know. Perhaps Holloway has been entering the house. He might have a key we don't know about. To what end? To frighten us away? He told us himself to leave. Maybe he wants the house for himself," Thomas suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Margaret opened her mouth to argue further when a loud thump sounded from the third floor, directly above them, in the empty room. Thomas's head snapped up, eyes wide. "That's no settling house," Margaret said quietly. Without a word, Thomas stood and walked purposefully out of the room and up the narrow stairs to the third floor. Margaret followed close behind, Eleanor's journal still clutched in her hand. The door to Lily's former room was closed, though Margaret was certain she'd left it open earlier. Thomas hesitated just a moment before turning the knob and pushing it open. The wooden horse and china doll, which had been on the bed in the master bedroom moments ago, now sat in the center of the empty room. But there was something else. A child's alphabet blocks arranged in a semicircle around the toys. They spelled out two words: "Find me." Thomas staggered back a step, colliding with Margaret in the doorway. "This isn't possible," he whispered. "Lily Clark is trying to communicate with us," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. I think something happened that night beyond what was reported in the newspaper, something that keeps her spirit bound to this house." Thomas turned to face her, his complexion ashen. "What do? We find her," Margaret answered simply. For several minutes, neither Margaret nor Thomas spoke as they stared at the toys and the message spelled out in wooden blocks. The afternoon light filtering through the windows had taken on the golden quality of late autumn, casting long shadows across the bare floor. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "Even if we accept that Lily's spirit is trying to communicate with us, what does find me mean? Find her grave? Find her body?" Margaret considered this, thinking back to Holloway's account and Eleanor's journal. The newspaper said she was buried at St. Peter's Church in Rutland, but you don't think she's there, Thomas finished for her. "I don't know. The journal suggests William Clark was abusive toward both his wife and daughter. If Lily's death wasn't an accident, if William was responsible—" Margaret couldn't bring herself to complete the thought. Thomas nodded grimly. "And Edwin? Eleanor's last entry indicated he was helping them plan an escape. Yet they never left," Margaret pointed out. "And afterward, Edwin continued to live in this house for decades, despite what happened here. That seems strange." A new thought occurred to her. "Thomas, what if we're meant to find something here in the house? Some evidence of what really happened that night? Where would we even begin to look? We've been through most of the rooms already." Margaret thought back to their explorations. "Not the cellar. We've only been in the part with the furnace, but I noticed another door down there that appeared to be locked." Decision made, they descended through the house, passing the second-floor bedrooms where the rocking chair sat empty by the window, down the main staircase with its repaired banister, through the entrance hall with its ticking grandfather clock, and finally down the narrow steps to the cellar. The temperature dropped noticeably as they entered the subterranean space. The furnace glowed dimly at the far end, providing minimal heat and light to the stone-walled chamber. Thomas lit an oil lamp he'd brought from upstairs, raising it to illuminate the shadowy corners. "There!" Margaret pointed to a heavy wooden door set into the far wall, partially hidden behind stacked firewood. Thomas moved the wood aside, revealing a door with a substantial iron lock. "It'll need a key," he observed, testing the handle. Margaret remembered the skeleton key that had opened the front door and the hidden playroom beneath the back stairs. She pulled it from her pocket and handed it to Thomas. The lock resisted at first, years of disuse causing the mechanism to stick. But with persistence and a drop of oil from the lamp, Thomas finally managed to turn the key. The door swung inward with a protesting groan, revealing a smaller chamber beyond. The smell that wafted out was damp and earthy, the scent of soil and decay. Thomas raised the lamp higher, illuminating what appeared to be a root cellar used for storing vegetables and preserves during winter months. Shelves lined the walls, still holding dusty mason jars filled with unidentifiable contents. "It's just a storage room," Thomas said, disappointment evident in his voice, but Margaret had noticed something odd about the dirt floor. "Look," she said, pointing to an area in the center of the small room. "The soil there is different, darker and less compacted than the rest." Thomas stepped carefully into the room, holding the lamp close to the ground. The difference was subtle but undeniable. A roughly rectangular area of soil, approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, appeared to have been disturbed at some point and then carefully smoothed over. "It could be nothing," Thomas said, though his voice had taken on a hollow quality that betrayed his true thoughts. "Or it could be everything," Margaret countered softly. They stood in silence for a long moment, contemplating the implications of what lay before them. Then, without discussion, Thomas handed the lamp to Margaret and retrieved a shovel that had been leaning against the wall in the outer cellar. "Are you certain we should do this?" he asked, hesitating with the shovel poised over the disturbed earth. Margaret thought of the toys appearing throughout the house, of Eleanor's desperate journal entries, of the childish plea spelled out in alphabet blocks, "Find me." "We have to know," she said simply. Thomas nodded and began to dig. The soil yielded easily, suggesting it had been turned over more recently than the decades-old tragedy would indicate. Margaret held the lamp steady, her free hand pressed against her mouth, as the excavation deepened. They didn't have to dig far. Less than 2 feet down, the shovel struck something solid with a dull thud. Thomas dropped to his knees, brushing away soil with his hands to reveal a small wooden box. Not a coffin as they had feared, but something roughly the size of a bread box. With extreme care, Thomas lifted the box from its earthen bed and placed it on the stone threshold between the 2 cellar rooms. Despite its time underground, the box appeared remarkably well preserved, its wooden surface oiled and protected against the damp. "Should we open it?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Margaret could answer, a tremendous crash sounded from upstairs, like furniture being overturned or a bookcase toppling. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of a child's scream, high-pitched and terrified, echoing through the house before cutting off abruptly. Thomas leapt to his feet, nearly dropping the lamp in his haste. "What in God's name—" "She knows we found it," Margaret said, staring at the box with a mixture of dread and determination. "And I don't think she's the only one." Thomas tucked the box under his arm, and they hurried back up the cellar stairs, the oil lamp swinging wildly in Margaret's hand and casting frantic shadows across the stone walls. The house had fallen silent again after that terrible scream, but the quiet felt charged, expectant, like the stillness before a lightning strike. When they reached the entrance hall, they found the source of the crash. The grandfather clock that had stood sentinel by the front door now lay face down on the hardwood floor, its glass face shattered and wooden case cracked. But what caused Margaret's breath to catch in her throat was not the destroyed timepiece, but what had been revealed behind it. A door, narrow and previously concealed by the tall clock, was now exposed in the wood-panelled wall. It stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. "I thought we'd found all the rooms," Thomas murmured, setting the box down on a side table and approaching the hidden door cautiously. "Apparently not," Margaret replied, following close behind. The concealed door opened onto a narrow staircase that wound upward between the walls of the house. These stairs were steeper and cruder than the main staircase, or even the servants' stairs, more like a ladder with steps than a proper stairway. They were barely wide enough for Thomas's shoulders. "It must lead to the attic," he said, testing the first step with his weight. "I'll go first." The hidden stairway did indeed terminate in a space beneath the eaves that neither of them had discovered in their previous explorations. Unlike the third-floor rooms with their proper walls and windows, this was a true attic, a long, low space with rough flooring and exposed rafters. The roof sloped sharply on either side, making it impossible to stand upright except in the very center. Thomas held the lamp high, revealing a space that had clearly served as living quarters at some point. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its frame simple but solid. A small table and chair occupied the center of the space, and a crude washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher stood in the corner. What made Margaret's skin crawl were the iron rings bolted to the floor on either side of the bed, with chains attached that ended in shackles sized for slender wrists. "Someone was kept prisoner here," she whispered, horror evident in her voice. Thomas moved the lamp closer to the bed, illuminating a small collection of items on the rough blanket. A hairbrush, with strands of long dark hair still caught in the bristles, a tarnished hand mirror, and a worn Bible. He picked up the Bible and opened it to the flyleaf, where a name was inscribed in faded ink, Eleanor Clark. "Not someone," Thomas said grimly. "Lily's mother." Margaret's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the story they'd uncovered. Eleanor planned to flee with Lily the day before the child died, but they never made it out of the house. William must have discovered their plan. Thomas continued the thought. "And when he did, he killed his own daughter," Margaret finished, the terrible truth settling over them like a shroud. "And imprisoned his wife here, where no one would think to look for her." "But for how long?" Thomas wondered aloud. "The journal we found was from 1887, but Uncle Edwin didn't die until last month. Are you suggesting Eleanor was kept up here for all those decades?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, I don't think she survived long after Lily. Which raises another question. What happened to William? If he killed his daughter and imprisoned his wife, why wasn't he ever brought to justice?" They both turned at the sound of a floorboard creaking behind them. There, at the top of the hidden staircase, stood a man, tall and thin, with a severe countenance that Margaret recognized immediately from the photograph she'd found in the library. "Uncle Edwin!" Thomas gasped. The figure took a step forward into the lamplight, and Margaret stifled a scream. The man before them was solid enough, but his eyes held a vacancy that spoke of death rather than life. When he spoke, his voice sounded distant, as if traveling across a great expanse to reach them. "I could not save them," the spectre said, his gaze fixed on something beyond the physical confines of the attic. "My brother was always the stronger one, even as children. When I confronted him about what he'd done to Lily, he attacked me as well. You died that night too," Margaret realized, her voice barely audible. Edwin's ghost nodded slowly. "William buried my body in the orchard behind the house, beneath the old apple tree. He told everyone I had traveled abroad suddenly on business, then he assumed my identity." "William pretended to be you?" Thomas asked incredulously, "for all those years?" "The brothers resembled each other enough to fool those who didn't know them well," the ghost continued. "William kept Eleanor alive for a time, chained here in this attic. When she finally succumbed to grief and mistreatment, he buried her beneath the root cellar." "And the box we found?" Margaret asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Mementos," Edwin replied simply. "Things William kept to torment Eleanor with during her captivity. He was always cruel in calculating ways." Thomas sank onto the single chair, the implications overwhelming him. "So the man who died last month, the man everyone in Rutland knew as Edwin Clark, was William all along?" Margaret finished. "Living in this house with the ghosts of those he murdered, including the brother whose life he stole." "But why leave the house to me?" Thomas asked, directing the question to Edwin's ghost. "Why bring us here at all?" The spectral figure's expression shifted subtly, a hint of something almost like satisfaction crossing his features. Because William feared discovery even after all these years, he never went into town if he could help it, never allowed visitors to the house. But in his final illness, he needed a doctor, and Dr. Whitcomb's son, who now practices his father's profession, saw something in William that made him suspicious. Questions were being asked. William needed an heir, someone who could legally claim the property and maintain the secrets it held. He chose me because I knew nothing of the family history, Thomas realized, because I would have no reason to look too closely at the past. But he didn't count on the toys, Margaret said softly. He didn't count on Lily. As if summoned by the mention of her name, a cold breeze swept through the attic, causing the lamp flame to flicker wildly. In that moment of semi-darkness, Margaret caught a glimpse of a small figure standing beside Edwin. A little girl in a white dress with a dark sash, her face solemn and pale in the wavering light. "She cannot rest until the truth is known," Edwin's ghost said. "None of us can." "The box," Margaret remembered suddenly. "We need to open the box." They returned to the entrance hall where Thomas had left the wooden box on the side table. It seemed smaller now, less imposing in the light of day, yet Margaret approached it with the reverence one might accord a holy relic. Thomas set the oil lamp beside it, though it was hardly needed with afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The box bore no lock, just a simple brass latch that yielded easily to Thomas's touch. The lid opened smoothly on well-oiled hinges, revealing contents that had been carefully preserved despite their years beneath the earth. On top lay a folded piece of paper that Margaret recognized as stationery, bearing the letterhead of the Rutland County Hospital. She unfolded it carefully to reveal a death certificate dated January 11th, 1887, the day of Lily's supposed accidental fall. But the name on the certificate was not Lily Clark. It was Edwin Clark, and the cause of death was listed as cerebral hemorrhage resulting from blunt force trauma to the skull. "He had the death certificate," Margaret whispered, "but he reported a different death to the newspaper. And since he was posing as Edwin, no one ever knew Edwin had died." Thomas completed the thought. Beneath the death certificate lay a small leather-bound book, not a journal like Eleanor's, but a personal Bible. Inside the cover was inscribed, "William Clark, Christmas 1875, in flowing script. Several passages had been marked with thin strips of cloth, and when Margaret opened to one such marker, she found Exodus 21-17 underlined in ink, "And he that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death." He was justifying his actions to himself, Thomas said grimly, twisting scripture to support his madness. The next item was a gold locket on a delicate chain. When Thomas pressed the tiny catch, it opened to reveal a miniature portrait of Eleanor on one side and a lock of dark hair on the other, presumably Lily's. The portrait showed a much younger woman than the haunted face in the daguerreotype, with bright eyes and a gentle smile that had been extinguished long before her death. Beneath these personal items lay something wrapped in faded silk. Margaret unwrapped it carefully to reveal a child's shoe, a small button boot made of soft leather, sized for a girl of 5 or 6. The matching shoe was absent, and the single boot showed signs of hard wear, with scuff marks on the toe and a worn sole. "One of Lily's shoes," Margaret said softly. "But where is the other?" The final item in the box answered her question, though in a way that made her stomach turn. It was a torn page from what appeared to be a personal diary, William's, judging by the handwriting. The entry was dated January 11th, 1887. "It is done. The child's body is where no one will ever find it. Edwin tried to interfere, the fool. He always was weak-hearted. Now he too is silenced forever. Eleanor screams still, but the attic is well insulated. Soon enough she will understand that her fate is sealed. As for the authorities, they will be searching the river downstream where I placed the child's shoe. By the time they realize their error, if they ever do, all evidence will have vanished with the spring floods." Margaret looked up from the diary page, her eyes meeting Thomas's. He threw one of Lily's shoes in the river to mislead searchers. There was never a funeral. There's no grave at St. Peter's Church. "The body is still here somewhere on the property," Thomas said, his voice hollow with the realization. The lamp on the table flickered suddenly despite the absence of any draught. The temperature in the entrance hall dropped precipitously, their breath becoming visible in the suddenly frigid air. From upstairs came the sound of childish footsteps running from room to room, followed by a door slamming with enough force to shake the chandelier overhead. "She's leading us," Margaret said, already moving toward the stairs. "We need to follow." They ascended the main staircase quickly, following the sounds to the third floor. The door to Lily's empty room stood open, but the toys and alphabet blocks were gone. Instead, a trail of small, wet footprints led from the doorway across the bare floor to the far wall. The footprints, child-sized and unnaturally clear, appeared to be made of water or some darker fluid. They stopped at a section of wall that, to casual observation, looked no different from the surrounding plaster. But as Margaret approached, she noticed a slight discoloration, a rectangular outline barely visible against the white surface. "There's something behind this wall," she said, running her fingers along the faint line. Thomas examined it closely, then pressed his palm against the center of the rectangle. With a soft click, a panel swung inward to reveal a shallow compartment in the wall cavity, a space barely large enough to contain what had been hidden there for nearly 40 years. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a small child, curled in a fetal position, as if seeking comfort even in death. Scraps of fabric, the remnants of what must have been a white dress with a dark sash, clung to the bones. And there, beside the tiny skeleton, was the mate to the leather boot they had found in the box. Margaret turned away, tears streaming down her face. Thomas stood rigid beside her, his expression a mixture of horror and profound sadness. "He walled her up," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "His own daughter." The room had grown impossibly cold, their breath hanging in clouds before their faces. The wet footprints on the floor were evaporating rapidly, but new ones appeared, adult-sized this time, walking from the hidden compartment to the door. As they watched, transfixed, more footprints manifested in the hallway outside, these smaller and clearly a child's. The two sets met at the top of the stairs, where they paused as if in confrontation. And then, in a moment that would haunt Margaret's dreams for years to come, a new set of footprints formed, a man being dragged backward toward the stairs, his heels leaving long smears across the wooden floor. The child's prints followed, and both sets disappeared at the top of the staircase. "William didn't kill Lily," Margaret whispered, the truth dawning on her with terrible clarity. "Lily pushed him down the stairs, just as he had threatened to do to her so many times. It was self-defense, and afterward, in his dying moments, he sealed her inside the wall to ensure she would never escape him, even in death." The days that followed blurred together in Margaret's memory, the somber men from the Rutland Sheriff's Department excavating the orchard to recover Edwin's remains, the county coroner examining the small bones from behind the wall, the reporters from the Herald asking questions that Thomas deflected with quiet dignity. Through it all, the house on Miller Hill remained unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. "It will be in all the newspapers tomorrow," Thomas said, as they sat in the kitchen on the evening after the authorities had finally departed. William's crimes, his decades of deception living as his brother, everything. Margaret nodded absently, stirring a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. Since the discovery of Lily's remains, the toys had stopped appearing. The spectral footsteps had ceased, and the house had settled into an uneasy silence. Edwin's ghost had not reappeared, nor had they glimpsed Lily's small form again. "What will become of the house?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Thomas sighed heavily. "It belongs to us, legally. But I don't think I could ever live here now, knowing what happened within these walls." "Nor could I," Margaret agreed quietly. They had taken temporary residence at the Rutland Hotel while the investigation continued, returning to the house only to speak with officials or retrieve needed items. Neither had suggested spending another night beneath its roof. "I've been thinking," Thomas said after a long silence, "about what we should do next." Margaret looked up from her untouched tea, studying her husband's face. The events of the past week had aged him, deepening the lines around his eyes and mouth. But there was also a newfound resolve in his expression that she found comforting. "We could sell the property," he continued, "once everything is settled legally. Use the money to start fresh somewhere else." "Where would we go?" Margaret asked, allowing herself to consider the possibility of a life beyond the shadow that had fallen over them. "Anywhere. Boston, perhaps, or further west. California, even." A hint of his old enthusiasm crept into Thomas's voice. "I've heard there are opportunities in San Francisco for a man willing to work hard." Margaret managed a small smile. "That sounds nice." But even as she spoke, she knew there was unfinished business that needed attending to before they could truly leave Miller Hill behind. The ghosts, both literal and figurative, that haunted the Clark house would not be so easily abandoned. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the first true day of winter, with frost etching delicate patterns on the window panes. Margaret woke early, a sense of purpose driving her from the warm hotel bed before Thomas had stirred. She dressed quickly and left a note explaining her absence, then walked the 1.5 miles to St. Peter's Church on the outskirts of Rutland. The old stone building stood peaceful in the morning light, its small cemetery a patchwork of weathered headstones and newer granite markers. The church was empty when she entered, the caretaker not yet arrived for his daily duties. Margaret moved quietly through the nave to the altar, where she lit 3 candles from the perpetual flame kept burning there. Then she knelt and prayed, not the formal prayers of her childhood, but a heartfelt plea for peace, for the spirits that had been trapped for so long in pain and anger. When she returned to the hotel, she found Thomas awake and waiting, worry evident in his eyes. "Where have you been?" he asked, relief washing over his features as she entered their room. "Making arrangements," she replied simply. "There's something we need to do before we leave Rutland." 3 days later, on a crisp November morning, a small group gathered in the Rutland cemetery. The Reverend from St. Peter's stood beside 3 freshly dug graves, his prayer book open in his hands. Thomas and Margaret were there, of course, as well as Holloway, who had insisted on attending despite his age and the bitter cold. A few curious townspeople stood at a respectful distance, drawn by the stories that had dominated the Herald's front page all week. The graves contained 3 simple coffins, one adult-sized for Edwin, whose remains had been recovered from the orchard, another for Eleanor, whose bones had been found exactly where the ghost had indicated, beneath the root-cellar floor, and a heartbreakingly small one for Lily, whose remains had been treated with special gentleness by the coroner's men. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust," the Reverend intoned as the first handfuls of soil were cast upon the coffins. "In the sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life." Margaret stepped forward, placing a single white rose on each grave. On Lily's, she also laid the wooden horse, its paint freshly touched up and its wheels oiled so they turned smoothly once more. "Do you think this will bring them peace?" Thomas asked quietly as they walked away from the cemetery. "I hope so," Margaret replied. "They deserved far better in life than they received. Perhaps in death they can find the rest that was denied them." That evening, as the sun set over the green mountains, Thomas and Margaret returned to the house on Miller Hill one final time. The building looked different somehow, less imposing, less mysterious, as if the revelation of its secrets had diminished its power. They moved through the rooms methodically, collecting the few personal belongings they had brought and leaving behind the furniture, books, and other items that had borne witness to decades of suffering. In the empty room on the 3rd floor, Margaret placed Eleanor's journal and the child's drawing on the floor where Lily's remains had been found. "Goodbye," she whispered to the empty air. "Be at peace now." As they descended the stairs for the last time, Margaret caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of her eye. A tall, thin figure standing at the window of the master bedroom, and beside him, the smaller silhouette of a child holding his hand. But when she turned for a better look, there was nothing there but the fading light of day reflecting on the glass. Outside, Thomas locked the front door and pocketed the key, though he doubted they would ever use it again. The borrowed automobile was packed with their meager possessions and ready for the drive back to Rutland, where train tickets to Boston awaited them. "What will happen to the house?" Margaret asked, as they walked down the gravel driveway for the last time. Thomas glanced back at the structure silhouetted against the darkening sky. "I've instructed the attorney to donate it to the county. They can decide its fate." As they drove away down the winding road, Margaret looked back just once. In the gathering twilight, she could have sworn she saw 3 figures standing on the porch, a tall man, a woman, and between them, a small child. They seemed to wave briefly before fading into the encroaching darkness. Thomas reached across the seat to take her hand. "Ready for a new beginning?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Margaret squeezed his hand, turning away from Miller Hill and its ghosts. "Yes," she said, and for the first time in weeks, she truly meant it. "I believe I am." The Clark house stood empty on its hill for many years afterward. Eventually, the county had it demolished, the land reclaimed by forest. But locals still speak of lights sometimes seen through the trees where the house once stood, and the distant sound of a child's laughter carried on the wind. And in Rutland Cemetery, visitors occasionally report finding toys, a wooden horse, a china doll, alphabet blocks, arranged in patterns on 3 particular graves. No one knows who leaves them there, but by the next morning they always vanish, only to reappear days or weeks later in different configurations, as if still being played with by hands unseen.